Welcome. Welcome. It's Thursday, December 2nd, 2021. We have an important talk today, elder fraud, financial mistakes, and caregiving. We'll be starting in a moment. I'll just wait as people join us. And I'll be introducing our speakers, Liz Loewy and Howard Tischler. Terrific folks, and I'll introduce them in a moment. Many members are facing challenges with aging parents and managing employees who are themselves facing challenges with aging parents, and asked us to bring in these experts to help. So we found two amazing people through one of our longtime members, Martin Murrell, a COO at Amalgamated Bank. So Martin, thank you. Liz Loewy is the co-founder of EverSafe. Liz, prior to that, was the founder of the Manhattan District Attorney's first elder abuse unit, and in fact served as trial counsel in the prosecution involving elder abuse of the late philanthropist Brooke Astor. This is a famous case, many of you know, it was in the news. And of course, Liz also has served as a caregiver for her parents and grandparents. Joining Liz is her co-founder for EverSafe, Howard Tischler, who started the company along with Liz after his mother was financially exploited and lost her life savings. Howard will discuss what happened to his mom and how he managed his joint corporate and caregiving responsibilities while serving as a group president and lead director in public companies, a position that many of you are in. There will be a robust Q&A session after we hear from Liz and Howard. Will tell us a little bit more about their company, but also, of course, about this challenge. So come ready to share your own stories or stories from your workforce as we get into the Q&A, and feel free to post the questions as we're going. Liz and Howard may stop and answer it at that point, or we'll wait for the Q&A session at the end. Liz and Howard, I really appreciate you joining us today. I know you have a lot going on, and this is such an important topic facing so many people. It really, I think, is so helpful to our members and to so many people. We appreciate it. So I will now step out of the way and look forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you everybody for coming. And we appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today. And as Phil mentioned, we are really on a mission to address these particular issues, and therefore we welcome this opportunity to speak with people on the topic. And we encourage you, this session is for you. So please ask questions, whether you want to ask in the middle or whether you want to wait to the end and ask your questions. That's how we can make this most valuable for you. And with that, I will turn it over to Liz.
Sure. And I wanted to thank Phil and Brittany as well. Good to be here. This isn't the happiest topic in the world, but it could be a happy topic. And we are not just going to sit here and scare you about fraud that can happen in later life or younger life for that matter. But we're going to spend a lot of this time focused on solutions as well and taking questions. Howard and I, as you heard from Phil, come from two different backgrounds. Howard has spent much of his career in finance and technology. He'll talk to you a little bit about what happened to his older mother, which is really a fairly standard story, I'm sorry to say, but I know that wearing my hat as a former prosecutor. So we're hoping that you learned something from this presentation, that we can have a conversation, and that maybe you'll even actually do something about it sooner rather than later. Because many folks now know about elder abuse and elder financial abuse, but many folks also, although they're learning about it, don't do anything about it. And so we have a feeling we know what's on your minds, what's on your loved ones' minds, and what's on your employees' minds when you think about sort of the road to longevity, We all know that people are living longer now, which is a good thing. But the truth is that although folks in this country and around the world, frankly, are living longer, they're living with new challenges. And it's really important to get in front of those challenges and to do so when you're younger and healthy and not in the midst of a crisis. So financial planning is super important. Unfortunately, some people who do financial planning really don't think about protecting their assets. Nobody wants to outlive their money. And so spending habits are important. And if you're keeping an eye on an older loved one, or you're even a caregiver for an older loved one, and frankly, if you're keeping an eye on a younger adult, say a college grad, you want them to have good financial health, good financial literacy, and to think about their spending habits. Physical health and, of course, cognitive health is something to think about as we get older. There are many ways people are preparing for physical issues, and they're thinking a little bit more now than they used to about the fact that they may not be quite as on top of things cognitively as they get older. There may be some decision-making that becomes compromised, and it doesn't necessarily jump out at you with red flags. So we're big proponents of getting in front of all of these issues, and family conversations, frankly, are really important to discuss all of these things in a non-threatening, sort of safe way, even around a holiday table, to just talk about preparing for some of these issues that happen in later life, which often include scams. I mean, they're out there. We all know that. Fraud, theft, identity theft, really important issues to discuss with your entire family. So every presentation, right, starts out with statistics, and that's what we're going to do, because I think the statistics that I'm going to have you ask you, at least to think about in the beginning of this presentation, are important. And I entitled this slide, Fraud in Later Life and Willie Sutton. So I think probably you know of Willie Sutton. He was that guy, he was that robber who said, why do I rob banks? I do it because that's where the money is. And that's really important when we think about fraud in later life. According to a big AARP study, in America, the folks who are 50 plus hold about 83% of US assets, hold most of the assets. You know, folks who are getting older are used to saving, maybe less used to getting advance payment loans on their salary, and people in their 70s and 80s have saved. And I know I'm generalizing, but I think you would agree with me. Think about all that money and the fact that right now, according to the Alzheimer's Association, 1 in 3 seniors now dies with some form of dementia. The most common form of dementia, as many of you know, is Alzheimer's type dementia. That's one kind. But when you think about all of those assets being held by folks who are vulnerable, and you think about Willie Sutton, then you know why elder financial abuse is such a huge problem. Because that bank is being held by people who have challenges, physical challenges and cognitive challenges. Something to think about when you're thinking about preparing for older age, another argument for protecting your money. Now, according to the AARP, it looked at older victims lose on average 120,000, it's actually 120,300 on average to elder fraud incidents. And caregivers too, this is a huge problem for caregivers. When we think about caregiving, we often think about perhaps employees that have to take time off for kids, right? Who are sick, or who have some issues. I think our minds don't generally go to those middlers. I hate the word boomers, but those folks in middle age that have younger kids they're caregiving for, but also older parents that have their own problems. So caregivers, according to Allianz, lose about $36,000 when older parents are defrauded. For what, you might say? Well, for trying to make them whole, for activities of daily living, for helping them back on track, for things like lost time at work. But those figures add up. So this is a huge financial problem for caregivers as well. And these are some stats that we think should be an argument for doing some things to get in front of this crisis.
So when you think about caregiving, there are different kinds of profiles. And I would say almost everybody, if not everybody I've met, fit into one of these 4 categories. They're either currently a caregiver, they're a former caregiver, they're going to be a caregiver, or one day they will be someone who does need care. So, like it or not, caregiving is critical. And there's not a training course that teaches you about being a caregiver. So it's important to start to address this early. And since we're talking to a lot of executives from companies, you probably have a fifth category, which is that you have employees who fall into one of the above categories. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue for employers, because you may have an employee who's worked for you for 20 years and they've been a great employee. And then all of a sudden you start to see that their productivity starts to fall off. And quite often that fall off in productivity is because they've now become a caregiver for a loved one. Next slide. So here are some numbers. Liz gave you numbers about elder fraud, and I'll give you some numbers about caregiving. But 1 in 5 full-time employees are family caregivers. And we're not talking about childcare here. We're talking about older or at-risk adults, which may be people that have physical or mental challenges. 92% of caregivers also provide what we refer to as financial caregiving. So most people, when they think about caregiving, they think about the health side of it and helping people along. A big part of that helping along is helping with their finances. And that may be paying bills, it may be monitoring their accounts, whatever the case may be. But 77% of caregivers feel overwhelmed. And if you've ever been a caregiver, I think you can relate to this one. It is extremely stressful, to say the least. And even though there are many rewarding times of being a caregiver, it doesn't diminish the fact that this is very hard and that you're not trained to be a caregiver. And 65% of caregivers sacrifice their own physical or mental health to take care of someone else. So an important part of being a caregiver is to make sure that you take care of yourself, because if you don't maintain your own physical or mental health, it becomes even more difficult to be a caregiver. And then lastly, most people, 69% over the age of 40, have not made plans for long-term care. And that's a big part of where caregivers then have to step in. Next slide. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my mother. Did the slide change?
No.
No. So while we wait for the slide, I'll still tell you about my mother. So my mother actually was an accountant and bookkeeper for many, many years. And it started with a telemarketer who called her and sold her an auto club policy for $80 a month. You might say, oh, $80 a month, what does that matter? But the fact of the matter is, she didn't own a car, she didn't have a driver's license, and she was legally blind. And after that, we think that she got added to what's called a sucker list, which meant that other telemarketers called her. And here it says targeted for multiple scams. A lot of these were legitimate companies. So when I talk about the auto club that was sold to her, it was a legitimate company that sold that auto club policy to her. And I actually heard the tape recording, the digital recording of that conversation. And all my mother said was yes. She was already a customer of that particular company. And they went through their whole pitch. And then they asked her if it was okay to charge her credit card. And she said yes. And they proceeded to do so. So she was sold other inappropriate products, some of them scams, some of them legit, but not things that she needed. And then she fell behind on her credit card bills. She had the foresight to get a long-term care policy that she stopped paying on. She also had the foresight to have annuities that would take care of her income. but she withdrew that money early and paid penalties on it. She then realized that she couldn't keep up with everything. And she brought a friend of about 30 years to help her pay her bills. And that friend helped her pay her bills, as well as helped herself to the rest of my mother's money. So her life savings was completely gone. And it all started from an $80 a month Auto Club membership. Now, Liz told you that caregivers, on average, $36,000. For my family, it was $500,000. And the reason for that is my mother went through nursing homes, assisted living, rehab centers, and basically, other than her Social Security income, we had to pick up that cost. And that went on for about 6.5 years before she passed away. So if any of you have ever been involved in those types of facilities, it is not cheap, I can tell you that. Next slide, please. So we talk about my caregiver experience. I didn't know much about being a caregiver other than I helped a little bit with my grandparents before they passed away. But it actually did start with a conversation. Not that I had ever read anything that I should have a conversation, but I sat down with my mother when she retired and I said, Mom, are you sure that you have yourself covered in retirement? And my mother said, I've got this. Here's my budget. Here's my income. Here's my expenses. I am all set. So after that conversation, I kind of went off and felt everything was okay. And I used to visit her every 4 to 6 weeks. She lived in South Carolina. I was in Maryland. But I took my mother to my niece's graduation. And at that point, I noticed, and my brothers noticed, that she was starting to have issues with her memory. So we said, Mom, maybe we should get an aide in to help you. And when I did that, we came back and I discovered bills, $8,000, $10,000. This was 1.5 years after the issue started. And then, as I mentioned, she went through, once somebody is exploited, their health actually takes a turn for the worse. And after she was exploited, we went through hospital, like I think maybe 2 weeks after I talked to her about what had happened, was the first time she had a mini stroke and went into the hospital. And then it was just a series of hospital, rehab, apartment, assisted living, nursing home. At the time, I was an executive at a Fortune 500 company. I actually had 6 divisions that I managed in 6 different cities around the country. I was also the lead director for a public corporation. So you can imagine I had a lot of travel. My mother's in South Carolina. I live in Maryland. One of those companies was in Maryland. 5 of them were not. So I was traveling a lot. Eventually, probably about 3 or 4 years into being a caregiver, I ended up leaving my job. I'm an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, involved in technology and financial services. So I did start another company, not EverSafe. EverSafe didn't get started until after my mother passed away. But I needed the ability to deal with everything that was going on. And that was really the only way that I could find to do it. But the one thing I did do that I'm happy that I did was that I did bring my kids in to help with various aspects of the caregiving, help me find facilities for my mother to go into, help move my mother out of her apartment, et cetera. And even though there's no training for a caregiver, if you ask my kids today, they will say they've gotten partial training. So that's one thing that I will recommend to people: bring other members of the family into it. Next.
I agree. That's really important. I heard Howard's story when we first met when I was a prosecutor. I'd like to say that I told him, wow, that's really unusual and really rare, but it's really, these cases are variation on a theme. If you listen to what happened to his mother, right? She had the forethought as a single lady to get long-term care insurance, which she stopped paying in order to pay a car club, basically an auto club service, when she didn't own a car and didn't use a license anymore and hadn't owned a car for years. So no more long-term care, and adult kids end up picking that up if they can. Fortunately, in Howard's case, they could. But this is it's not unusual. Other cases that I prosecuted before I left the DA's office, because I think pictures help illustrate what's going on, just as Howard's mother's story did. These are just honestly typical types of cases. There's a woman left here wearing the purple off-the-shoulder number. She was actually someone who stole from 3 different gentlemen in Manhattan. She just picked them up, really found them, one at a store, one in the park where a lot of older people hung out. One of the victims actually wore a lot of keys around his neck, which I guess was a telltale sign. He had like maybe 20 keys in almost like a necklace. And one of them had been in a car accident and had brain damage as a result of the accident. Another had dementia. There was a third. So she would befriend them and offer to do favors for them. They did have family members, but the family members were out of town. There was an accountant there wearing that nice suit who stole from a Holocaust survivor who was in a nursing home. She had mild dementia, but a lot of relatives outside the US, and he was supposed to be bookkeeping and acting as a power of attorney at this fancy law firm, and instead he stole money over time, just in a very ordinary way, just with debit cards and checks. He stole almost 1.5 million. Another gentleman in the right-hand corner, I shouldn't call him a gentleman, he's an older defendant who said that the victim, who was 98, was like a father to him. They worked in the same office. There was a man in his 90s still working as an attorney and giving this man here with the glasses on the lower right his office space. And when the 98-year-old broke his hip and went in the hospital, he stole from him. He started internet banking, right, for a 98-year-old. And then the middle case is the Brooke Astor case. And some of you may have heard of it. Sentence was about 10 or 11 years ago. This was an only son. If you think this only happens to people who don't have money, absolutely not true. The Astors they were a well-known philanthropic family, but when Brooke Astor developed Alzheimer's type dementia, her son, her only son, who was her executor, her power of attorney, her healthcare proxy, who worked for her for almost $500,000 a year, he went to an office for a few minutes a week, stole from her, changed her will, had her change her will. She had no idea what she was signing. It was a $60 million residuary estate, and did all this over time. Finally, his son, Mrs. Astor's 2 grandsons, couldn't take it anymore. They weren't even allowed to visit. They tried to isolate her, went and moved for guardianship because they couldn't stand how she was living. So these are all common cases. Honestly, many of them, none of them really, you couldn't have predicted that they would have been victimized. And people ask me, what are some of the common things that happen on elder fraud cases? Well, often victims are vulnerable, but it's not as though they go to sleep one night and they wake up vulnerable. You can be vulnerable, you can become vulnerable over time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, right? It can just be regular, not dementia, not mild cognitive impairment, but regular old memory loss that happens as you age, so you're not quite as good with your money. You should know that none of the cases I just told you about, and I had a unit of 18 prosecutors, this is usually the case. Many of them, if not most of them, are not referred by the police. And they're not referred by any one bank or firm or credit union or financial advisor or employer. They're usually discovered by family members or close friends who finally, they don't want to talk to their parent about the fact that they're older. I mean, Howard had that conversation early, but then things got out of hand later. But eventually family members who don't want to infantilize their parents find out. All these cases, I would say there was lack of comprehensive monitoring, both by the bank and the firm and credit card companies, and at home. The fraud went on for months, sometimes years before it's discovered. We did a survey in the DA's office. The average was about almost 15 months before it was discovered and identified. And Howard talked about people dying. People may not realize that when an older parent, an older person is exploited, that they're more likely to die early than if there's physical abuse in later life. University of Texas did a study of all the different forms of elder abuse, and this was a mortality study. And out of all the different forms of intentional elder abuse, elder financial abuse at the lowest survival rate, we saw this because I had a rule that my prosecutors had to go visit the victim, even if they were 80 or 90 or 100. And even if they had dementia, I wanted that victim to be visited by the prosecutor. And many of them passed away shortly after they were exploited. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but usually when we talk, we're asked about what the common scams are. And it's really difficult to make a list, but we have some of these up. These are common scams. People don't realize that often power of attorney can be a great and helpful tool. Unfortunately, powers of attorney get access to funds, and I shouldn't say unfortunately, because a POA used by someone trustworthy can be really helpful. If it's a durable POA, it withstands the incompetence of the principal, the older person, but powers of attorney have access to funds, and sometimes they don't act as a fiduciary. So POA abuse keeps prosecutors' offices busy. There are many different types of investment scams. Now, robo-investing. You might be surprised to learn that if you look at elder fraud cases, the greatest number of exploiters actually are within the family. Relatives and caregivers are the largest group of exploiters of seniors. Often it starts out with one adult child doing all the work. And there are a couple of different children. They do all the work. They feel as though, I'm missing work. I'm spending my own money. And it starts out with borrowing money from mom or dad, or they tell their siblings, mom or dad said, because I'm the one helping the most, I can help pay for Johnny's college. But they haven't neatened it up with anything in writing. And it gets bigger and it becomes a theft case. We all know about lotteries and sweepstakes scams. You all know there's no Nigerian prince. Lots of phishing with, the so-called IRS writing to folks. These guys are very good at what they do. I use a big bank. I got a text the other day from my big bank. It looked like the actual address. It said my account had been locked for some reason. I was a prosecutor for almost 3 decades, and I took a second look. They're good at what they do. The Nigerian prince scams, I think we all know. The texts and the other emails that you get or the phone calls you get are sometimes very different, very difficult it's very difficult to see right away that it's a scam. So we do a lot of education on that, and you should too, frankly. Hopefully your family members and your employees are getting some education on current scams, because the COVID scams were really quite sophisticated. Right? Offers for low-cost testing at home, offers for appointments for vaccines. A lot of these weren't even grabs for money, but just grabs for personal information. So these are just some of the common scams. Again, most of them, even the current ones with COVID, are just variations on a theme. We also usually get asked, what are signs that your aging loved one may need help? And there's no one sign. And there's no one solution. And I wouldn't even say that you can always get an answer on this by taking that older adult to a doctor, a neurologist, a psychologist. It really usually is a pattern. And I tell people that if you get that little warning in your head, if your older loved one is repeating the same thing in 3 to 5 minutes that they said before, and they didn't do that in the past, that's a sign. Anything that's unusual. And when I give presentations for financial institutions, I say the same thing. You look for unusual activity in banking, and you look for unusual activity in the person. So I will say we had some cases with folks in their 80s or 90s where they said, they're stealing my money, the bank's stealing my money. We had a case where it was a guardianship agency, and they said, this agency's stealing my money. And lots of folks discounted them as a paranoid senior for a while. And it turns out many of these older folks that have lost a little capacity or repeat themselves are perfect targets for scammers. So look at things like overdue bills. Look for trouble with bill paying. Look for a brand new person in that senior's life. You know, at a financial institution, sometimes we get calls about, hey, there's this brand new relative. We didn't know she had a nephew or a son from across the country. These are all warning signs. A new change in a beneficiary, if that estate plan has been consistent, can be a warning sign. But it's usually a pattern with one or more of these kinds of things. An acceleration in investment activity. You know, an activity on a dormant account, right? So sometimes credit cards and debit cards are left at the back of a drawer. And if all of a sudden that new one is used, it could be a sign that there's a new caregiver, a new cleaning person, a new repair person in the home who's taken it and is using it. And of course, closed accounts, early withdrawals, these are change is what you look for in the financial accounts and in the person themselves or their new companion. Now, we couldn't really do a presentation on this without talking about the fact, I would call this is the biggest fact that we're all in denial about as we age, and that's just cognitive capacity. And there's something called financial capacity. It's just really a fancy word for how you're doing on managing your money. Can you, if you still have a checkbook, are you checking it? Are you balancing it? Are you able to manage your spending? Are you able to manage your bills? Well, there's a lot of research that's been done on this now. And many of the experts, many neurologists, many of the scientists feel that issues with managing your money and that show up in your day-to-day managing of your money are actually the first sign of potential cognitive impairment. And one of the experts that looked into this is named, well, there's a few of them, but one that we work with a lot is named Jason Karlawish from the University of Pennsylvania. And he feels that issues with managing your money are actually more accurate as far as whether you may have some cognitive impairment than an MRI or a scan. He thinks they show up first in the way you manage your money. So there's a great New York Times article that we often put up here, and we can send it to anybody that talks about this, talks about how they're not always obvious. But unfortunately, this article says you start, and I'm going to emphasize start, to lose your ability to manage your money in your early 50s, about 53. So something to prepare for, something to think about. We all get some memory loss as we age. It's not, we also gain wisdom. It's not all a sad story. But even folks who are cognitively normal do reach a point where managing their money does become a challenge, and these are things to look out for. So I'm going to talk about some strategies and some solutions. I think Howard shares this belief, and many folks who are focused on what happens with folks who get defrauded in later life think that the number one way you can prevent this is by getting in front of it, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Have the family conversation. If you have loved ones that are older, they don't have to be 85. It can be younger or older, but have a family conversation, by the way, with younger adults too. We had this conversation with my college grad kids about managing money and keeping an eye on your money. Scammers are busier than ever. They have lots to choose from. Most Americans have a bunch of different accounts, not just a deposit, not just one depository account, one investment account, and one credit card. They have a checking account, a savings account, different investment accounts, many of us, different credit cards. That is tough. You have to find a way to keep an eye on all of these accounts. Educate loved ones, educate clients, customers, and employees about the current scams. I didn't go into all the current ones, but we do those presentations. We can discuss the current COVID scams and vaccine scams and give you examples and pretty pictures on how common they are and what to look for. But you know those guys who are phishing are going to find a new way, but discuss them. So folks know when they get that text from the big bank, they'll know it's a scam. Talk about professionals that can support your loved ones. And by the way, I've done many polls when I give presentations on how many folks of middle age know who their parents' financial advisor are, know where they bank, know where their investments are, know who the insurance companies are, even know who their doctors are. Most of them don't know. Have a conversation about those folks. So if and when there's a crisis, they know where to go. We're very focused on trusted contacts. At EverSafe, we call them trusted advocates, but financial services now, they're starting to look at the feature of a trusted contact so that if your investment firm right now, your broker dealer actually opens up a new account or is updating your current accounts, they're supposed to ask you whether you'd like to have the name of a trusted contact according to FINRA rules, so that they can reach out if they see suspicious activity. There are banks that are considering doing that as well. Talk about whether you want to have one or a few trusted contacts. Monitor financial activity. This seems like it should be obvious. You're probably saying, oh, great tip, Liz, monitor financial activity. Most people are not. And they're not doing it with a family support system. I can tell you that as a prosecutor. Most of the folks who came in told me, I bet Howard wishes he had gotten to his mother earlier, was worried about infantilizing her since she used to be a bookkeeper and his mother used to be a Juilliard trained pianist, and she had it together. You can have it together, but not be watching your money. And employers should really consider benefit options that support caregiving. I know they're doing this for child care, not so much with senior care. And so these are just some of the tips that we feel are important. Technology tools we feel can also really help with this. We think they can be instrumental with helping caregivers protect loved ones. And so we were going to talk to you about a few tech solutions because we're big believers in those. We're going to spend a minute or two on EverSafe, and we're also going to spend time on other tech tools that we have no affiliation with whatsoever. But we're both big believers that technology can absolutely be a game changer when it comes to protecting yourself, your older parents, hey, and your kids who call themselves adults, like my kids do, even though they're in their mid-20s. And I just wanted to share something with you that was more or less a surprise to me when I started. Actually, I learned this when I started law school. I really saw it as a prosecutor. Right now, when people hear about what I'm doing, they say, you know what? My bank is doing this for me. Or they'll say, my credit card gives me great alerts. Or, financial institutions have this covered. Well, my unit of 18 prosecutors, even when crime was down in New York City, cases went up every year. The reason why cases go up, and it's still not being attacked in a meaningful way, are a few reasons, and they're really just summarized in this slide. Number one, there's really no visibility any one bank or investment firm or credit card has across your accounts and across institutions. So I would say when I was a new assistant DA and I started handling fraud cases, I thought that my big bank would be able to call over to where I have investment accounts, investment products, if they saw suspicious activity on my bank account. Might be news to some of you, they can't because of privacy regulations, okay? Because of Gramm-Leach-Bliley and other regulations, unless terrorist financing or money laundering is involved, a bank can't just pick up the phone and call my credit card company or my investment firm to talk about what's going on with me. I believe scammers know this. So most of the cases my unit got involved multiple accounts and multiple institutions. Every case I showed you on that slide that said every picture tells a story involved a number of financial institutions. So even if your bank had the best analytics in the world, they can't look at everything. Same with static alerts, okay? Another issue. my big bank, not picking on them, and I'm not mentioning them, asked me if I wanted special enhanced fraud monitoring on my bank account, my depository accounts. I hit yes. They permitted me to choose one amount and get alerts for transactions over that amount, and one alert and get transactions under that amount, and that was pretty much it. That is not real monitoring that moves with me, that is based on my behavior, that changes with age. My debit card, I used it really late when I was younger. I'd use it at 12, 1, 2 in the morning. I don't anymore. Well, maybe once in a while. But, you know, the alerts at the bank aren't changing with age. Finally, sharing of information at the bank. My father, thank God my father's doing great. He's in his 90s. He wanted me to get copies of his account statements. They said, no, not unless you make the account joint. So Graham Leach Bliley again stops older people, even if they have trustworthy kids, from just sending account statements to them. And that's a problem. And this is really the genesis of EverSafe and why we think technology could be a game changer. Also, involving family, I talk about the family conversation. You know, why is it that technology is not being used routinely by banks, firms, credit unions, anywhere where there's, you know, the holding of your assets to notify a team if there's a problem? So if you're a son in DC, in Philly, in New York, you have older parents in Florida, just pick that state. I hear there's older people there. And a daughter in California, why not use technology to reach out at the first sign of a problem? And so this is really something when Howard and I met, and he called me during the Astor case and just kept calling, which was great. But I tried to explain to him why this problem is so huge and why he was really just a number with respect to elder fraud cases that we were handling. And this was really the genesis for EverSafe. And Howard, if you could talk about EverSafe, that would be great.
Okay, we'll do. So as far as EverSafe, I'm going to run through this quick so we can get through our Q&A. But EverSafe, we use machine learning to establish a personal profile on people and then identify what has changed in their behavior and send alerts not only to the individual, but to what we refer to as trusted advocates. So that could be loved ones, caregivers, professionals, and then we track that suspicious activity through to resolution, including we have technology that allows financial institutions to refer cases to Adult Protective Services, state securities regulators, the U.S. Postal Inspector, quite often the mail is involved, et cetera. So we are really focused on technology. I'm going to run through a couple of other technology solutions really quickly. Can you go to the next slide? So it's important to establish online access to your accounts. I saw somebody asked about whether freezing the credit was sufficient. I tried to answer that, at least give a quick answer to that in the chat section. But you need to establish online access to your bank account, Social Security, veterans benefits, IRS, your cell phone account, really important. Opt out of marketing databases. We will get out a list after this. We'll get it to Phil to issue to everybody. We'll give you a
checklist, Howard. Checklist. Okay.
Yeah, we will get you a list of places along with URLs for those. Next screen, please. It's also important to block those strangers from coming in. So scams that come in, they can come in over landlines or cell phones. There's a service that we recommend on a landline. It's free. It's called Nomo Robo. You can see the name and the URL up here. And on the cell phones, Nomo Robo can be used on a cell phone. Also, it costs, I think it's $1.99 a month, pretty reasonable, as well as another service called umail.com. I know cell phone providers today are supposed to block spam calls. The fact of the matter is their technology is not as good as some of these independent providers. Next slide, please. So some of the other things that the screen's not changing for me. I don't know whether you see it is.
No,
So
I don't know. Oop. Just hit the down arrow on the keyboard, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm obviously having some issues, but
okay,
Howard, keep talking.
yeah, so some of the other things, there are companies out there that use technology to help you find independent living, home aides that can come into the home. It's a service called A Place for Mom. You might have seen their TV ads. It does not cost the caregiver anything, but it is a great service to help find an appropriate place for your parent. Also, if you need transportation, there's a service called Go Grandparent, of all things, and that is good. It doesn't require a cell phone, but you can call them and they will get transportation to an older loved one. Also, to establish a legacy, you see some services up on here. We will send these out in a list as well. Directive Communication Systems takes care of assets and other types of digital assets after an individual passes away. Next screen, please. Estate planning tools, we'll get this list out as well. Next screen, please. And then spending controls. Bill payment is a huge issue, was a huge issue for my mother. We are coming out with a bill pay module in EverSafe. There's also prepaid debit cards. TrueLink Financial actually has a prepaid debit card that will block certain expenses. So you can still keep your parents independent, but control their spending somewhat. So let's open up the floor to Q&A at this point.
Great. All right. So Jessica Coster and Elizabeth Peasley, I'd like you to join us live if you're open to that. Jessica, you posted a good question about your mother who's having memory issues and has become more apparent since your father passed away. And Elizabeth, I know you're starting to deal with some stuff. So Brittany, if you can help bring them in. While they're doing that, just some couple questions about your company. So first of all, your business model, who's your main customer, the elderly or their adult children? And who's in your competitive space, and how do you see yourselves? What's your differentiator?
So it's really 50-50. Half of our enrollees are over the age of 55 and half of them are under the age of 55. We market primarily through financial services organizations. So there are a number of leading financial institutions across the country that offer EverSafe to their clients. We also do some direct-to-consumer marketing. As far as competitors are concerned, a lot of people will think that we are, quote, LifeLock for seniors. Fact of the matter is, identity theft is really a very, very small part of the problem. We certainly cover identity theft, but we address far more issues. We look at the person's financial life holistically. So we're looking at all of their detailed transactions. Companies like identity theft companies look primarily at the dark web, and they look at the credit report. We actually pull raw credit data and analyze what's going on with individuals.
Okay.
And we also send alerts to any number of designated folks that can form a team. It can be your kids, and a POA. You can have one trusted advocate or 5 or 10. It's up to you. And that's another differentiator.
Great work. This is becoming a bigger deal, and we all need to get smart about this. All right, so Elizabeth and Jessica, let's unmute you both. Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about your situation, and then Jessica, why don't you follow up with yours?
Sure, thanks. So I have my father passed away many years ago. My mother is in her early 80s, and just, I guess, lucky for me, just decided to put herself in assisted living about a year ago because she was tired of, she says, I'm tired of cooking for myself. Through that process of her moving into assisted living and having to significantly downsize, my sister and I visited her a couple of times and found lots of paper, lots of bills, like all the stuff I've been taking notes on, all of the things you've been talking about, the late bill paying. Then she gets 3 bills and she pays all 3 of them. So then she's got this ginormous credit because she doesn't realize they're cumulative. And this, Howard, I'm with you. My mom is a CPA. So she's fiercely independent about her finances. And so it's been that's been our biggest challenge, is trying to help her with the financial stuff without making her feel like we're taking away her independence. That's probably our biggest challenge. And so I guess maybe in all of this, I feel most lucky that my mother never answers the phone. I'm so glad now that she never answers the phone when I call, because I know she's not answering the phone for other people. But one of the things that we did when she moved into her apartment was we moved her to a voice over IP phone instead of a landline. So now I can get online and I can view all of the calls that are coming into her, and I can listen to all of her voicemails. And if there's something really questionable, I feel like my sister and I are trying to divide and conquer on the keeping an eye on things, but it's a huge challenge, especially because you brought up this one thing about not being able to see her accounts. She has IRAs that I'm still trying to figure out. My sister has power of attorney. I don't, how we can get visibility, and just, this is a fairly new process for us. So like 6 months in, I think we're still trying to figure out how can we maintain visibility from afar to make sure things don't go the 15 months you talked about before anybody notices anything, while still not stepping on my mom's independent toes. So this has been very, very helpful to hear about all this. I really want to thank you.
We'd be happy to talk to her offline about getting what you need, especially if she's POA. It shouldn't be a problem. And about keeping an eye on all the accounts. It's really pretty easy. You link them once, and then you can both get alerts. So.
Right, and we don't make it necessarily about memory loss when having the conversation with folks. It can be, now, maybe your mother's a little bit further along, but it can be about, you want to maintain your independence. You want to be able to travel. You want to be able to go visit the grandkids, whatever the case may be. And you can think of it as a second set of eyes. That's really what we're about, is that you can keep an eye on things. And if you saw on the previous slide that Liz brought up, we are all about maintaining the dignity of the individual and maintaining their independence. And quite honestly, that was important with my mom, even after I discovered what was going on with her.
I mean, that's important because these conversations are hard to have. I mean, it's even hard to begin the conversation. Forget whether you agree on exactly how we're going to address this. So, and that's a whole other session we could have about, like, how do you actually begin to have this conversation? But Jessica, I think that is relative to your question. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's happening with your mom?
Yeah, definitely resonate with a lot of the things that were said today, just in terms of wanting to jump in sooner and what she did. Just the history for everyone else. My dad passed almost a year ago this month at the end of 2020, and was apparently covering up, I think, some money issues for mom. So, she went through a good chunk of their savings, had maxed out their credit cards over about 10 months. So just really in the last month or so with the selling of their home, we realized that, there's all these credit card bills. She had $500 to her name the day of the closing, which I had managed, and we don't yet have power of attorney. So it's sort of like, where do you start? And how do you maintain that, letting her, have some space, but at the same time, like, she's shown she's not capable of kind of handling the money issues. And we don't want it to get any worse, right? Because she will need care, and she's been sort of in and out of hospitals, in and out of rehab. So she's definitely on a bit of a decline.
Yeah, it is really tough. There are lots of articles out there that talk about, like, managing your parents' money. You're now the parent, and that's just so insulting, really. Your parents are always your parents. You're never their parents. And I do think it's a conversation that needs to be had, but I do think that we like to give people ideas on how to have it. What we do is, if you get alerts on your older parents' accounts, we've made it so that you don't even have to see the balances, right? So you can just get an alert and not see transactions and not see balances. When I did this with my dad, I had the same concerns when we were developing EverSafe. He's much older than me. And I said, oh, and you can get alerts on my accounts as well, because I'm busy too. And he said, to try to even the playing field and show this was for everyone. He was like, no, thank you, Liz. I don't want alerts on your accounts, but I'd like you to get them on mine. So,
and that's an important thing about leveling the playing field with your parents.
Yeah,
I think that's really, really important and critical. I kind of started down that trail with my mother. I didn't follow through on it. But I think that is really important. And it's important to have the conversation
Hey,
earlier
Howard.
rather than later.
Howard,
If you
let's
wait
address,
until there are problems, that's
we
hard.
have time for one more question, and it's in the chat on page. She's saying, you know, my parents are not interested in these discussions. Part of your service, helping to have the conversation. What do I do?
We have a booklet that we can send out on
Great,
having
let's get that
conversations.
out. Let's get that out to our community. That would be super helpful.
We will get that to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, I think the work you're doing is really important. As we saw from Elizabeth and Jessica, and I've been getting a lot of texts, you know, this is difficult. It's fraught with so many emotional issues, and the degree to which we can have the conversation and the degree to which we can actually start to put in some safety guards, some safety rails like these alerts. And you raised things, I have to admit, I thought I was pretty informed on this, and I have actually managed the you know, both during their lives and after their deaths, the estates and accounts of various parents and in-laws. I have to admit, I thought most scams were outside the family, not inside the family, despite the Brooke Astor case, Liz. And the fact that you pointed out that it's actually more in the family and POA abuse, I never even thought of that there could be, I mean, that makes total sense the moment you said it.
Yep.
So we have to get more educated on this, and we need companies like yours out there. So I'm really glad you're doing this. I appreciate you taking the time today. I know a lot of people plan to be watching the recording later, and we'll get those materials from you, the checklist, the booklet. I know that's going to be really helpful. And now for members watching this later, as well as those live today, if you have more questions, you know, I'm sure, you know, we can get those answered. And also, if you're interested in thinking about how your company might work with EverSafe, you know, either because you're a financial institution or because you want to do something with your employees, let us know and we'll send that along to Howard and Liz. So thank you both really so much. And thank you everyone for being here today.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. And wow, okay. All right, so as we go into the holidays and have more conversations with our families.
Right, exactly. Well, that's the time to have conversations like this, but that's at least what I think. It really, it's once you start having the conversation, it becomes a lot easier, so.
Yeah. I found it took a couple of years with one of, I won't say who, with one of my adult, you know, folks to get them to warm up to the idea.
Right.
Yeah.
The worst is finding out about this stuff too late. So there's so much denial with all of this. And that's the sad part, is just address it early, right?
And you know, the funny thing, money is such an emotional issue for every age, right? And we all feel, including me and my Harvard MBA classmates, that we're not doing it the right way, or we're afraid if people find out how we're handling our money. So it's emotional at any age, and just, you know, hey, you know, no judgment, right? Let's open this up and let's bring in some support. I had one, I'm not going to name who, but one person who did, they made some quick snap decisions during the great financial crisis. They sold assets at the low of the market, you know, just locking in the losses.
Yeah.
And I, you know, they didn't talk to me about it, you know, and they're fine, but I tell you, they'd be in better shape if they hadn't done that. So,
Yeah.
you know, it happens. But the tools you're putting together, it's in the pamphlets and information, really appreciate the time today.